A shared context helps teams work together. This is not a feel-good statement. This is actually an instructional guide to get your teams to work together, right? And to make it work, we have to actually unpack what does it mean to generate a shared context. If we don't have a shared context, we should assume our teams cannot work together, right? So what is it that we can do as a leadership team, as a management team, to make sure that we generate shared context where we need them and possibly use different contexts to make teams work separately where it is desirable for them to do that? Because sometimes you don't want teams to work together. So let's take a quick look here at this example I prepared for us. And in this example, I talk about two different tasks. One is performing a brain surgery, and the other is designing and weaving a simple basket. I think a lot of people would say brain surgery is a higher, cognitive load task than designing and weaving a basket. But let's take a look at some of those other factors, because the task itself is not the full picture, right? So the environment, the tools, and the skills will modify the total cognitive load applied to an environment, right? So when we look at this, let's look at this brain surgery task. Let's say that the brain surgery is performed in the environment of a forest with flexible sticks by someone who weaves baskets regularly. Now, that is going to be a much higher cognitive load task. In fact, so high you probably will fail than somebody who is in a modern operating room with proper surgical tools and by somebody who has spent years practicing fine hand movements, right? One of those, wherever this task itself is, performing brain surgery, is increased in complexity by the environment, the tools, and the skills available to the person performing the task. Or actually, we can even decrease this, right? So brain surgery has decreased in cognitive load, or at least the types of brain surgery accessible to us have expanded, right? We can approach types of brain surgery that were impossible before. We are still the same humans, but we have deepened, those hand training skills, right? I've seen very interesting exercises where surgeons practice tying knots with their hands in intricate ways to learn different hand movements, right? That did not exist 200 years ago, 100 years ago, 50 years ago. And, with proper surgical tools, these are getting better all the time, right? We're now getting into places where robots are performing the surgery. And in a modern operating room, even just an operating room from, let's say, 50 years ago, the new ones, and not just the room itself and the furnishings, but the way that room operates, that reduces so much of the complexity to do this thing correctly versus, something that's a complete mismatch for the task. But it's not, it's not one thing. There's no best practice environment, tools, and skills without context of the task, right? So if we look down here and say, okay, well, actually, my task is design and weave a simple basket. And if I did that in a modern operating room, again, run the way a modern operating room is, with the sanitary conditions and the protocols and the check-in, check-out procedures to make sure you didn't leave a scalpel inside of a body where everything's barcoded, with proper surgical tools to weave a basket, this would be so complicated to do this, right? To weave a basket with scalpels and clamps and things like this by somebody who spent years practicing fine hand movements, possibly not a huge impediment, but it's not conducive to the task necessarily. Maybe for some parts of it, but this brain surgery level detail is not really necessary. And, let's look at that other side here, right? Design and weave a simple basket in a forest, right? So you're going to weave a basket in a forest. There's lots of sticks around. It's kind of easy to get access to them with flexible sticks, right? By someone who weaves baskets regularly. Guaranteed, if you're going to weave a basket, you do not want to be doing it in an operating room with surgical tools and all this stuff. You do not need the best practices available for a different type of task, right? You need the best practices that complement your task. So the point here is, you can increase and decrease the cognitive load to perform that task. A lot of people think about the task and say, how do we slice and dice that task to be easier? Can we take vertical slices? Can we take horizontal slices? Can we remove or ignore part of the problem? Those are good techniques, right? Those are all very valid. But a lot of this stuff has nothing to do with the task. It has everything to do with the environment, the tools, the skills, the context surrounding the task itself. Now, is it likely that a brain surgery team will work with a basket weaving team? Probably not, right? In fact, if you did need them to work together, the context that they have to share, right? If you force the basket weavers to work with the doctors, it would be, very burdensome to have them work together in the same environment with the same tools and the same skills. The communication lines, while they can talk to each other, it's just a higher burden of communication. And the purpose for the communication needs to go through a big shift each time. So if it was something where, a brain surgeon had to talk to an anesthesiologist or a heart surgeon or something like this, they would have a much more common set of things to work on, right? Similarly, somebody designing and weaving a simple basket might have more in common with possibly somebody who's foraging mushrooms in the forest, or somebody who is, doing bushcraft camping or something of this nature. So the point here is, if we think about this, right? In our previous video, we took a look here at, what keeps teams together. And one of the things we said is having a common target to make the direction of travel the same so they stay together. But what about this gray circle around them, right? And that is a little bit of the context that they're in. And so if they are in completely different environments, completely different tool chains and skill sets, the cost to change collaboration mode, to work together, to do these interactions are higher. So keeping them together and keeping the interactions, low bandwidth between the teams is also quite high. But it's also high, even inside of those teams, right? So if I have an individual here and here, getting them to work together inside of a team is also, a high complexity, high cognitive load operation. If even inside of the team, we have different tools, different skills, different things like this, it does make sense to have a cross-functional stream. But at some point, if there's no reason for them to work together, right, on the same thing, and there's no common environment and the combination of those things, it's hard to keep them together, right? And that's something else your leadership group, right? Remember in a previous video, I said, what does a leadership group do? It's this cross-team enabler that keeps alignment of people, process, product, and tech. And a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of that is the context that a team operates in, right? So can you influence the environment? Can you influence the tool chain? Can you influence the skills and keep them all going in the same direction? So these are not, you need both of them, binary and statement. I think these are just forces that apply that will help you keep teams together or make them drift apart. And we've seen this before, right? We have teams that stay together, like as a group of teams, right? A group of teams can stay together when they have different targets. And that is partially because, their context that they operate in is so tightly shared that it enables that, right? So these are just different forces that will keep your teams together or push them apart, right? So keeping the cognitive load on a common set of tasks, or at least keeping the environment, tools, and skills on different tasks for different missions will be one force that can keep your teams together, even if you have different targets. But it's even better if you have one target and a common environment, that keeps them really stuck together. And it's you do have an interesting challenge here, which is sometimes you do want to keep teams separated, right? And there's different reasons for that. If you think about inverse Conway maneuvers, The way you design your teams is the architecture you end up with. It might make sense to introduce additional complexity. You might have the same target, but if you introduce additional complexity and say your environment is different, your tools are different, or possibly your skills are different, you introduce friction that force those teams to drift apart. And that can be desirable. It can also be undesirable. And you really have to have a case-by-case conversation about how you want to influence the evolution of your organization. And so that's just a little bit of an explanation here on the mechanics of how a shared context will help teams work together or push them apart, right? This is not a feel-good statement. This is an instructional statement. This is a fundamental force that you can use to shape your organization.